January 17, 1940, Berlin. The snow falls silently on Tirpitzufer, clinging to the iron gates of the Abwehr headquarters like frozen secrets. Inside, beneath vaulted ceilings that once echoed with imperial ambitions, a young analyst named Klaus Hartmann sits at a mahogany desk, his breath visible in the unheated room. Before him, a stack of intercepted radio transmissions from Poland, coded photographs from agents in London, and a map of Europe bleeding red ink across its western edge. His fingers, stained with cigarette ash and carbon paper, trace the lines of a continent being redrawn. He does not yet know that everything he believes about his work, his nation, and the war itself will crumble like the ash from his cigarette. He does not yet know that in 5 years he will sit before American interrogators and speak truths that will haunt him until his final breath. This is not a story of heroes. It is a story of a man who served the machinery of conquest and lived to confess its inner workings. A man whose revelations would peel back the facade of the Third Reich's vaunted intelligence apparatus and expose the rot beneath the swastika banners. The Abwehr in 1940 was still cloaked in mystique. To the German public, it was the silent sword of the Reich. Omniscient, infallible, the unseen hand guiding Wehrmacht victories across Europe. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, its enigmatic chief, cultivated this image deliberately. He appeared in newsreels as a fatherly figure, steady and inscrutable, a man who knew the enemy's thoughts before they were spoken. But Klaus Hartmann, who sorted the daily flood of intelligence reports in Section 3F, knew a different truth. Why, he saw the gaps in the data, the guesswork masquerading as certainty, the report stamped reliable source that were based on little more than rumor and wishful analysis. In those early months of 1940, the Abwehr still rode the momentum of Poland's swift collapse. The files that crossed Hartmann's desk told a story of coordination. How agents had photographed Polish fortifications months before the invasion, how saboteurs had seized key bridges before the 1st Panzer rolled across the border. The system worked when the enemy was weak, when the machinery of blitzkrieg moved faster than counterintelligence could respond. Hartmann believed, as his colleagues believed, that German intelligence was simply superior, more disciplined, more thorough, more aligned with the inevitable arc of history. He expected the work to continue this way, clinical, efficient, victorious, a war of maps and code-breaking, where intellect triumphed over chaos. But by the autumn of 1941, as Hartmann pored over reports from the Eastern Front, something began to shift. The Red Army was supposed to collapse within weeks. The intelligence briefs had said so. Canaris himself had presented estimates to the High Command. Soviet morale was brittle, their logistics primitive, their leadership decapitated by Stalin's purges. Yet the reports coming back from Army Group Center told a different story. Soviet units, declared destroyed, reappeared days later. Factories the Luftwaffe had bombed were producing tanks again within a month. Entire armies materialized out of the Siberian wastes, divisions the Abwehr had no record of, equipped with weapons whose existence had been dismissed as propaganda. Hartmann sat in his cold office and read casualty figures that climbed with each dispatch. He read intercepted Soviet communications that spoke not of collapse, but of defiance, and he began to understand. The intelligence had been wrong. Not slightly wrong. Fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. The Abwehr had told the generals what they wanted to hear, and the generals had believed it because it fit their vision of racial superiority and historical destiny. There was no single moment of disillusionment. It accumulated like ice on a window pane, layer by imperceptible layer. It was there in the silence of his superiors when agents in England stopped transmitting. Turned, Hartmann suspected, though no one spoke the word aloud. It was there in the frantic requests from the front for information the Abwehr could not provide. Where are the Soviet reserves? How many T-34s remain? When will their fuel run out? It was there in the realization that the intelligence service of the so-called master race was flying blind, feeding optimistic projections to commanders who were bleeding divisions into the Russian mud. By 1943, the pretense had become unbearable. Hartmann's section was tasked with producing assessments of Allied invasion plans. The senior analysts were certain the attack would come at Calais, the narrowest point of the Channel. The logic was unassailable. The fortifications at Normandy were therefore minimal, the reserves positioned far to the northeast. Hartmann read the reports from agents in Britain, many of whom he suspected were feeding false information, and felt a creeping dread. The certainty was too neat, too convenient. The enemy was not stupid, but to question the consensus was to question the competence of men who had built their careers on infallibility. So the reports went upward, stamped and approved, and the machine ground on. He expected to serve the Reich with his mind, to be part of a coldly rational apparatus that saw the world as it truly was. What he experienced instead was ideology masquerading as analysis, wishful thinking dressed in the language of certainty. The Abwehr, he came to realize, was not an intelligence service. It was a priesthood, interpreting omens to fit a predetermined doctrine. On June 6, 1944, Klaus Hartmann stood in the operations room and watched the red pins multiply across the map of Normandy. The room was silent except for the crackling radio and the scratch of pencils marking positions. No one spoke the obvious truth, that the greatest amphibious invasion in history had achieved complete surprise, because the intelligence service of the Third Reich had convinced itself it could not happen there. Hartmann felt something break inside him that day, not his loyalty to Germany, which was already a ghost, but his faith in the structures of reason and expertise. If the Abwehr could be this wrong, what else was false? What else had been built on sand? The files tell us that by late 1944, Hartmann had begun keeping a private journal, a dangerous act in a surveillance state. He wrote not in rebellion, but in a desperate attempt to preserve some record of reality against the tide of official delusion. He documented the collapse of the intelligence network in France, the fabricated reports of wonder weapons that would turn the tide, the assurances that the Ardennes offensive would split the Allied armies when every rational assessment showed it was doomed. He wrote about the suicides among his colleagues, men who could not reconcile the world they had been trained to analyze with the inferno consuming it. In his interrogation transcripts, preserved now in the National Archives, Hartmann would later describe the final months in Berlin as a kind of fevered dream. The Abwehr had been absorbed into the SS intelligence apparatus after Canaris fell under suspicion. The admiral himself arrested, the old guard purged. The new leadership demanded not analysis, but affirmation. Hartmann typed reports he knew were fiction, attributing Soviet exhaustion to battles that had never been fought, projecting Allied supply shortages that did not exist. The Red Army was, according to these documents, on the verge of collapse. In reality, it was 30 miles from the Reich Chancellery. On April 22, 1945, Hartmann burned his files. Not on orders, but out of shame. He carried the ashes to the courtyard and watched them scatter in the smoke that already choked the city. He had spent 5 years serving an intelligence service that prided itself on seeing clearly, and he had watched it go blind by choice, by ideology, by the inability to speak truths that contradicted the Führer's vision. What was the point of intelligence, he wondered, in a system where reality itself was subordinate to belief? 3 weeks later, Klaus Hartmann walked west. He discarded his uniform, buried his identity papers, and joined the rivers of refugees fleeing the Soviet advance. He expected execution, or perhaps a long, anonymous death in the rubble of a civilization that had devoured itself. What he experienced instead was capture by an American reconnaissance unit outside Magdeburg, followed by months of interrogation that became something stranger. Confession. The Americans were hungry for information, but they were not what he expected. Hartmann had been trained to see the enemy as crude, their intelligence services amateurish and corrupted by democratic softness. But the officers who questioned him were meticulous, patient, and disturbingly well-informed. They already knew much of what he could tell them. They wanted context, motive, the architecture of failure, and Hartmann, exhausted and unmoored, found himself speaking truths he had barely admitted to himself. He told them about the Abwehr's penetration of the Soviet Union before Barbarossa, extensive on paper, hollow in practice. He described how agents had been inserted with great fanfare, only to disappear into the vast spaces of Russia, their reports sporadic and unreliable. He explained the circular logic that had doomed German intelligence. The assumption that Slavic peoples were inherently inferior meant that their military capabilities were consistently underestimated, which meant that every surprise, every new Soviet tank model, every reserve army conjured from the Urals was treated as an aberration rather than evidence that the foundational assumptions were wrong. He spoke about the intelligence failures in the West, how the Abwehr had badly underestimated British resolve after Dunkirk, how the belief that America was weakened by racial diversity and democratic inefficiency had led to catastrophic miscalculations about industrial capacity. Hartmann described sitting in briefings where analysts dismissed reports of American aircraft production as impossible exaggerations. Surely the figures were inflated by a factor of 10. But they were not. The United States was building bombers at a rate that would have required the entire industrial output of the Reich to match, and the Abwehr had failed to grasp the scale until the skies over Germany went dark with them. In one transcript, Hartmann recalls a moment from 1943. An agent's report from Detroit had included photographs of the Willow Run bomber plant, a mile-long factory producing B-24s at a rate of 1 per hour at peak capacity. The images were circulated among senior analysts. Hartmann watched as they studied the photographs and concluded that they must be propaganda fabrications, that no industrial facility could operate at such scale. The alternative, that America's productive capacity was an order of magnitude beyond Germany's, was too destabilizing to accept. So the report was filed, the implications ignored, and the 1,000-bomber raids continued. But Hartmann's most damning revelations concerned the internal politics of intelligence itself. He described how the Abwehr under Canaris had become a battleground of factions, with different departments producing contradictory assessments and the most optimistic always winning favor with the high command. He explained how the SS intelligence service and the Abwehr competed for Hitler's attention, each trying to outdo the other in certainty and boldness, creating a system where caution was career suicide and accuracy was irrelevant compared to ideological alignment. The Americans asked him, "Did you ever provide intelligence that contradicted the leadership's assumptions?" Hartmann's answer, recorded in the dry language of interrogation notes, was devastating in its honesty. "Yes," he said, "several times. The reports were received politely, filed, and ignored. The machinery of decision-making did not want complications. It wanted confirmation." Among the objects salvaged from Hartmann's belongings when he was captured was a fountain pen, a Mont Blanc Meisterstück, black with gold trim, engraved with his initials. It appears in the inventory of his effects, a small detail buried in the bureaucratic records of prisoner processing. In his later interviews, Hartmann would mention this pen repeatedly, almost obsessively. He had received it as a gift upon joining the Abwehr, a symbol of the intellectual prestige of his work. He had used it to draft hundreds of reports, each one bearing his signature, each one a small brick in the edifice of catastrophe. The pen became, in his memory, a symbol of complicity. He had not pulled triggers or signed deportation orders, but he had written the documents that gave false confidence to men who sent divisions to die in battles that should never have been fought. The pen, with its smooth gold nib, had been the instrument of his participation in a system that mistook ideology for insight. It was, he said, the most shameful object he had ever owned, and he was glad the Americans had confiscated it so he would never have to touch it again. After the interrogations, Klaus Hartmann faced a choice that would define his remaining years. Some former Abwehr officers retreated into silence or self-justification. writing memoirs that portrayed themselves as apolitical professionals, misled by fanatics. Hartmann chose a different path. Through the 1950s and 1960s, he became one of the most prolific sources for historians studying German intelligence operations. He sat for interviews, provided documents he had hidden, corrected misconceptions in emerging scholarship. He was not seeking redemption, he said as much, but rather trying to ensure that the truth was not lost in the rubble of the Reich. In a 1962 interview with a British historian, Hartmann was asked what he thought was the greatest failure of German intelligence during the war. His answer did not focus on missed secrets or unbroken codes. The greatest failure, he said, was the inability to imagine that the other side might be competent, might be resilient, might possess virtues that did not fit the racial hierarchy the Reich had constructed. German intelligence failed because it could not see the enemy as they actually were, only as ideology said they must be. He described the shock of reading captured American documents after the war, seeing the sophistication of their intelligence assessments, the careful hedging of conclusions, the willingness to admit uncertainty. The contrast with the bombastic certainty of Abwehr reports was stark. The Americans, he realized, had been comfortable with ambiguity in a way that the German system could never tolerate. In a dictatorship, admitting you did not know something was dangerous. Better to project confidence, even if it was baseless. Hartmann also spoke about the human cost of intelligence failures, a theme that became more prominent in his later reflections. He had processed casualty reports as abstract data, numbers on pages, units marked destroyed on maps. But after the war, he met survivors, men who had fought in the battles his assessments had helped shape. He heard first-hand accounts of divisions sent into encirclements because intelligence had assured the generals that Soviet forces in the area were exhausted and demoralized. They were not. Entire regiments vanished into the cauldrons of the Eastern Front, and Hartmann's reports had been among the documents that said it was safe to advance. One encounter stayed with him. In 1956, at a small gathering in Munich, he met a former Wehrmacht officer who had survived Stalingrad. The man recognized Hartmann's name. He had seen it on intelligence summaries distributed to field commanders in late 1942. Those summaries had painted a picture of Soviet desperation, of an enemy on the brink. The officer told Hartmann, quietly and without anger, that he had watched 30,000 men march into captivity because the high command believed the intelligence reports more than they believed the evidence of their own eyes. Hartmann had no answer. There was no answer. The symbolic weight of his fountain pen returned to him often in these years. He would mention it in lectures to students, using it as a parable about the dangers of bureaucratic complicity. The pen, he said, was no different from the rifles carried by soldiers or the stamps used by administrators. It was a tool, and in the machinery of totalitarianism, every tool could become an instrument of catastrophe. The question was not whether one's role was small or indirect, but whether one had the courage to recognize when the system itself was diseased. By the 1970s, Hartmann had become a fixture at conferences on intelligence history and the ethics of state security. He was an uncomfortable presence, a man whose past gave him authority but also made his critiques painful to hear. He spoke bluntly about the seductions of certainty, the institutional pressures that rewarded confidence over accuracy, the ways that intelligent people could convince themselves they were serving truth while actually serving power. In one particularly notable lecture at the University of Heidelberg in 1974, Hartmann addressed an audience of young scholars and intelligence professionals. He told them that the greatest threat to good intelligence was not enemy deception, but self-deception. The Abwehr, he said, had been defeated not by superior Allied spycraft, though that existed, but by its own inability to report truths that contradicted the Reich's mythology. The lesson, he insisted, was universal. Any intelligence service in any nation could fall into the same trap if it allowed ideology or political pressure to corrupt the process of analysis. He was asked inevitably whether he felt guilt. Hartmann's answer, delivered in the same measured tone he had used throughout his career, was yes. Unequivocally. He felt guilt for every report he had signed without pushing back harder, for every moment of silence when he might have spoken, for the times he chose career safety over intellectual honesty. But he also felt something else: responsibility. Guilt, he said, was a private emotion. Responsibility was public. His responsibility was to ensure that the mechanisms of his failure were understood, so that future analysts might recognize them in time. The records show that Klaus Hartmann died in 1981 in a quiet apartment in Frankfurt. He was 71. His obituary in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung was brief, noting his service in the Abwehr and his post-war contributions to historical scholarship. It did not mention the fountain pen, or the snow falling on Berlin in 1940, or the long arc from belief to disillusionment to testimony. But the archive remembers. In the boxes of declassified interrogation reports, in the transcripts of conferences, in the margins of books where his corrections are preserved, Klaus Hartmann remains, a voice from inside the machine, explaining how it worked and why it failed. His revelations were not dramatic secrets or explosive exposures. They were something more valuable, a detailed autopsy of institutional rot delivered by someone who had breathed its air and absorbed its logic before finally recognizing the poison. The story of Klaus Hartmann is not unique. The files of the post-war period are full of men like him, functionaries, analysts, middle-ranking officers who cooperated with Allied interrogators and historians, providing the raw material for our understanding of the Third Reich's inner workings. But Hartmann stands out for the clarity of his self-awareness and the unflinching nature of his testimony. He did not minimize his role or hide behind the defense of following orders. He acknowledged that he had been part of a system that turned intelligence into propaganda, and he spent decades explaining exactly how that transformation occurred. What made his revelations particularly damaging to any lingering myths about German efficiency was their specificity. Hartmann did not traffic in generalities. He provided names, dates, document numbers. He described the exact bureaucratic processes by which bad intelligence was elevated and good intelligence suppressed. He explained the informal networks of favor and ideology that determined whose assessments were taken seriously, and most cuttingly, he detailed the ways that intelligent, educated men like himself, had rationalized their participation in a system they knew, at some level, was built on lies. In one interview from 1968, Hartmann was asked whether he thought the Abwehr could have functioned differently under the Nazi regime, whether there was any way for an intelligence service to maintain objectivity in a totalitarian state. His answer was pessimistic. No, he said. The problem was not individual corruption or incompetence, but the structure of power itself. In a system where the leader's intuition was treated as infallible, intelligence could only ever be a supporting actor in a script already written. The moment Hitler decided that the Soviet Union would collapse, or that Britain would sue for peace, the intelligence apparatus was obligated to find evidence supporting those conclusions. The alternative was to challenge the Führer's judgment, which was both professionally suicidal and ideologically unthinkable. This was the core of Hartmann's revelation, that the failure of German intelligence was not a bug, but a feature, hardwired into the nature of Nazi governance. And by extension, he implied, any authoritarian system would face the same problem. Truth-telling and dictatorship were fundamentally incompatible. The epilogue to Klaus Hartmann's story is written not in his life, but in the legacy of his testimony. The documents he helped authenticate, the processes he explained, the self-deceptions he laid bare. These have become foundational to our understanding of how the Third Reich functioned and why it failed. Historians studying the intelligence failures of other regimes, from the Soviet Union to Saddam Hussein's Iraq, have found in Hartmann's accounts a pattern that repeats with eerie consistency: the closed loop of ideology, the punishment of dissent, the elevation of certainty over accuracy. But there is a deeper lesson in his story, one that extends beyond intelligence analysis or military history. Klaus Hartmann was an educated man, trained in languages and analysis, someone who prided himself on intellectual rigor. He was not a fanatic or a sadist. He was, in the words of one historian, a typical product of the German professional class, competent and ambitious and fatally willing to suspend moral judgment in service of institutional belonging. His descent from confident analyst to complicit bureaucrat to penitent witness traces a path that thousands of others followed, and his decision to testify, to turn his shame into documentation, offers a model for how societies confront their darkest chapters. The fountain pen that Hartmann mourned, that symbol of his complicity, was eventually returned to his widow after his death. It sits now, according to one account, in a private collection of World War II artifacts displayed alongside other objects from the period, a visual reminder that the instruments of catastrophe are often mundane, even elegant: a pen, a signature, a report filed and forgotten until the consequences became undeniable. On that cold January day in 1940, when snow fell on Berlin and a young analyst believed he was serving the machinery of inevitable victory, Klaus Hartmann could not have imagined the journey ahead. He could not have known that the certainties he worked to construct would crumble, that the system he served would destroy itself, that he would spend the remainder of his life explaining to anyone who would listen exactly how the illusions were made and maintained. But in the end, that became his purpose: to stand as a witness from inside the darkness, describing its contours so that others might recognize the shape of it before the light goes out. His story is a reminder that intelligence, true intelligence, requires the courage to see things as they are, not as we wish them to be. It requires institutions that reward honesty over loyalty, accuracy over ideology. And it requires individuals willing to speak uncomfortable truths, even when silence would be safer. The Third Reich had brilliant minds, sophisticated systems, and vast resources. What it lacked was the capacity for honest self-assessment, and in the end, that lack proved more fatal than any military defeat. Klaus Hartmann learned this too late to change his country's fate, but he learned it soon enough to tell us. And in the telling, he transformed his shame into knowledge, his guilt into warning. The machine he served devoured millions and then itself. The pen he wielded contributed to that devouring. But the testimony he left behind, careful, detailed, unsparing, serves as an antidote to the very certainties that made the catastrophe possible. This is what he revealed: that the greatest secrets of the Third Reich's intelligence apparatus were not operational details or spy networks, but the mechanisms of institutional delusion. That the vaunted efficiency of German intelligence was a myth, maintained through intimidation and wishful thinking. That the analysts and officers of the Abwehr were not master strategists, but prisoners of an ideology that forbade them from seeing reality clearly. And that the path from confidence to catastrophe is shorter than we imagine, paved with small compromises and rationalized silences. In the end, the snow fell on Berlin, as it always does in winter. The gates of Tirpitzufer stood silent. The reports were filed and forgotten. The Reich collapsed. And Klaus Hartmann, who had once believed that intelligence was about knowing the truth, spent the rest of his life teaching a harder lesson: that in the service of lies, even truth-seekers become liars. The only redemption is in the telling, in the meticulous reconstruction of how we were deceived and how we deceived ourselves. In the willingness to say, for the record and for history, here is what we did, here is why we did it, and here is why it was wrong. That is the secret, Klaus Hartmann revealed. Not the codes or the agent networks, but the architecture of self-destruction that any nation, any system, any institution can build if it values certainty over truth, loyalty over honesty, ideology over reality. His confession is a map of that architecture, drawn by someone who helped construct it, and then, at great personal cost, chose to expose its flaws. The fountain pen is silent now. The reports have been declassified. The secrets have been told. What remains is the lesson, preserved in archives and testimony, waiting for those wise enough to learn it before the machinery of delusion begins its work again. This is the revelation of Klaus Hartmann, that the enemy of intelligence is not secrecy but certainty, and the price of that error is measured in the ash of cities and the silence of the dead.